The quiet hum of a multi-thousand-dollar espresso machine was the first thing that registered. Then came the smell of dark roast beans and salt air drifting in from the Pacific. I sat in a low gray armchair, rubbing the back of my neck where a dull ache had settled after 4 hours of sleep on a rigid modern couch. The California sun was already blinding, pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the cliffside living room. The light bleached the hardwood floors and highlighted the sharp, clean lines of the expensive furniture. I blinked, adjusting to the glare, and looked across the coffee table. Aurora was sitting on the edge of the light-colored sofa, leaning forward slightly. The sunlight caught the golden tones in her blonde hair, which hung loose and slightly messy around her shoulders. She was smiling, a genuine, warm expression that completely erased the severe, untouchable CEO mask she wore in the boardroom. But that wasn't what made my brain stall. She was wearing my clothes. Specifically my oversized white button-down shirt, left unbuttoned at the top, draped comfortably over a black-ribbed tank top. It hung off her frame, sleeves rolled up past her wrists. I glanced down at myself. I was in my undershirt, a plain gray t-shirt, sitting with my back partially to the sweeping hallway of her house. "Why are you wearing my shirt?" I asked, my voice still rough with sleep. Her smile deepened, the corners of her eyes crinkling. She held a ceramic mug in both hands, letting the warmth bleed into her skin. "Don't you remember last night?" I remembered the chaos. I remembered the boxes of financial records piled high on her dining table, the glare of my laptop screen and the ticking clock. I was Jackson Hart, an independent forensic accountant. Companies hired me when the numbers didn't make sense and the internal auditors were either too scared or too compromised to find the truth. Aurora Evans had hired me 48 hours ago when she realized her own board of directors was staging a hostile takeover. "I remember," I said, keeping my tone measured, urban, and entirely professional, despite the strange gravity of the room. "The storm knocked out the coastal highway. You spilled black coffee all over your silk blouse at 2 in the morning while trying to read a mezzanine debt schedule. I handed you my overshirt because your dry cleaning hadn't arrived and the house temperature dropped." "You did," Aurora said softly. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "You also told me to stop looking at the K1 schedules and ordered me to sleep. You said you had it handled." "I am contracted to find the missing capital," I replied, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my knees. I kept my hands loosely clasped. I did not focus on the way the white fabric of my shirt looked on her. I focused on her resilience, the fading dark circles under her eyes, the fact that for the first time in 2 days, her shoulders weren't locked near her ears in a state of permanent defense. Your fatigue was a liability to my process, therefore, sleep was the logical recommendation. Aurora laughed. It was a low, grounded sound. "You're a terrible liar, Jackson. But the coffee is ready, and the Wi-Fi is back up." She stood, placing her mug on a cork coaster, and walked toward the kitchen. I watched her go, my chest feeling strangely tight. Not with panic, but with a sudden, unfamiliar sense of stillness. My entire life was lived in the margins of other people's disasters. I dropped into a crisis, audited the ledgers, destroyed the corporate threats, and left. I didn't have a kitchen like this. I didn't have quiet mornings. I had hotel rooms, secure servers, and a suitcase. The sight of her in my shirt, moving easily through her own home, created a sudden silence in my head. It felt like walking out of a windstorm into a fortified room. I stood, adjusting the hem of my gray t-shirt, and walked over to the dining table. The battlefield. Hundreds of pages of financial disclosures, quarterly earnings reports, and subsidiary filings were organized into neat, color-coded stacks. This was my domain. Elias Vance, her rival co-worker and the loudest voice on the board, was aiming for her position. He had formally proposed a buyout from a private equity firm, claiming Aurora's logistics company was hemorrhaging cash and facing insolvency. The board vote was tomorrow at 9 a.m. Vance had the leverage. He had the board's ear. He had fabricated an emergency. I booted up my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a blue glow over the mahogany table. "Did Marcus send the offshore routing numbers?" I asked, switching effortlessly back into the tactical mindset. Aurora walked back into the room, handing me a black mug. The ceramic was hot against my palm. "He sent an encrypted file 10 minutes ago. I didn't open it. I waited for you." "Good." I took a sip. It was exactly how I liked it. Black, no sugar, a little too strong. She had remembered from the single cup I made yesterday afternoon. I set the mug down and typed in my decryption key. "Elias is careful," Aurora said, standing on the opposite side of the table. She pulled the lapels of my white shirt closer together. The corporate armor was gone, leaving only the woman who had built this company from the ground up, terrified of losing her people to a corporate gutting. "He controls the internal audit committee. If he's hiding assets to make the company look insolvent, he buried them deep." "He didn't bury them deep enough," I said, my fingers moving across the keyboard. "People like Vance lack imagination. They use the same standard evasion protocols." I opened the spreadsheet Marcus had sent. Lines of raw banking data flooded the screen. "Look here." Aurora walked around the table and stood beside me. She didn't crowd me, but her presence was a steady weight at my side. I could smell the faint scent of vanilla and the clean cotton of my shirt. I focused strictly on the screen. "Q3, I pointed to a column. "Vance authorized 3 major capital expenditures for warehouse automation. The vendor is listed as Apex Logistics Solutions." "I signed off on those," Aurora said, her voice tightening with a sudden edge of defensiveness. "We needed the infrastructure upgrade." "You signed off on the allocation," I corrected gently. "But did you personally verify the vendor's incorporation status?" She paused. "No. The procurement committee handles vendor vetting. Elias chairs that committee." Apex Logistics Solutions was incorporated in Delaware exactly 4 days before the expenditure was approved, I stated, highlighting the data row. The registered agent is a shell corporation located in the Cayman Islands. The funds didn't buy automation equipment, Aurora. They were routed through Apex, converted into untraceable treasury bonds, and sit completely off-ledger. Aurora stared at the screen. Her breathing hitched, just once, a sharp intake of air. "He stole it. He created a liquidity crisis by draining our own cash reserves, then positioned himself as the savior with the private equity buyout." "Standard hostile sabotage," I said, my voice dry. I hit print, sending the file to the laser printer in her home office. "He's artificially deflating your company's value to force a sale. It's highly illegal and remarkably sloppy." "Sloppy?" She stepped back, crossing her arms. "Jackson, he fooled the entire board. He fooled me. If you hadn't found this—" Her voice wavered, the exhaustion threatening to crack her composure. I stood up, pushing the chair back. I turned to face her. She was powerful, brilliant, and entirely isolated. She carried the jobs of 400 employees on her shoulders, and her own board was stabbing her in the back. I felt the sudden, fierce instinct to fix this. Not just the numbers, but the toll it was taking on her. "He didn't fool you. He abused a systemic blind spot," I said, my tone flat but absolute. "You are the CEO. You steer the ship. You cannot be expected to count the rivets in the hull. That is what I do." She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face. There was a vulnerability there that I rarely saw in my line of work. Usually my clients were angry or desperate. Aurora was just tired of fighting alone. "What's the next step?" she asked. We document the chain of custody. We map the wire transfers. We prepare a counter dossier, I said, establishing the plan with concrete dates and tasks. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., you don't defend yourself. You go on the offensive. He'll try to spin it. He'll say the automation project was just delayed. He can't, I said, because I'm going to pull the property records for the Delaware Shell Company. By tonight, I will have the paper trail proving Vance is the sole beneficial owner. Aurora let out a long, shaky exhale. She reached out, her hand resting on the edge of the table just an inch from mine. I looked at her fingers, the neat, unpolished nails. I kept my hand still. I did not close the distance. The restraint was a conscious, physical effort. My job was to be the shield, not a complication. "Thank you, Jackson," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. We have a lot of reading to do." For the next 6 hours, the house was a sanctuary of silent, focused work. Outside, the California sun beat down on the coastal cliffs. Inside, the only sounds were the clicking of my keyboard, the rustle of paper, and the occasional scratch of Aurora's pen as she cross-referenced internal emails against my bank data. I watched her work out of the corner of my eye. She was relentless. She didn't complain, she didn't take breaks, and she didn't eat. By 2 in the afternoon, I noticed her rubbing her temples, a small crease forming between her brows. Her focus was fracturing. I stood up without a word. I walked into her massive, pristine kitchen. It looked like it belonged in a magazine, barely used. I opened the refrigerator, found a carton of eggs, some spinach, and a block of sharp cheddar. I pulled a skillet from the rack. 10 minutes later, I walked back into the dining room and placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast directly over the ledger she was reading. Aurora blinked, startled. "What is this?" "Fuel," I said, tapping the edge of the plate. "Your glucose levels are dropping. Your cognitive function is going to degrade if you don't eat. I need you sharp for the legal review." She looked from the plate to me. "I didn't ask you to cook." "I didn't ask for permission," I replied, sitting back down at my laptop. "Eat, Aurora. The Cayman files aren't going anywhere." She picked up the fork. She took a bite. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. "You're very bossy for a consultant." "I prioritize asset preservation," I said smoothly, not looking up from the screen. "You are currently the most valuable asset in this room." It was a statement of fact, plain truth. I heard her swallow, the clink of the fork against the porcelain. When I finally glanced over, she was watching me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. It wasn't corporate calculation. It was something softer, something that felt entirely too heavy for a Friday afternoon. "You don't let people in easily, do you?" she asked. "I analyze risk," I answered, scrolling through a PDF. "People are the ultimate variable. They are unpredictable, ergo, high risk." "And what am I?" I stopped typing. I looked at her. She was still wearing my white shirt. She looked like she belonged there, safe, grounded. "You're the client," I said. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, a necessary lie. Before she could respond, my phone vibrated violently against the wood table, an encrypted text alert. I picked it up, swiping open the message from Marcus. My stomach dropped. The cold reality of the situation crashed back into the room. "What is it?" Aurora asked, immediately sensing the shift in my posture. Her CEO armor snapped back into place. "Vance moved his timeline," I said, my voice clipped. I turned the laptop screen toward her. A financial news site had just published a breaking article. Exclusive. Coastal logistics firm faces insolvency. Board weighs emergency buyout. "He leaked the rumor to the press," I said, scanning the article. He cited anonymous internal sources claiming a severe cash flow crisis. The stock price is already taking a hit in after-hours trading. Aurora stood up, her face pale. He's trying to force the board's hand. If the public thinks we're going under, the board will vote for the private equity buyout tomorrow just to save their own equity. She began pacing the length of the dining room. Her breathing was shallow. It's over. If the shareholders panic, the legal fees alone will bankrupt us before we can prove the embezzlement. He trapped us. Stop, I said. I stood up and walked into her path, forcing her to halt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, the panic threatening to pull her under. I can't stop, Jackson. Everything I built, every employee who relies on me, it's gone because of a leaked rumor. She was spinning. The sheer weight of the responsibility was crushing her. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I offered stability. I reached out and took her hand. I didn't pull her into me. I just held her hand, my thumb pressing firmly against the back of her knuckles. It was a grounding wire, a physical transfer of stability. I locked my knees, standing perfectly still, absorbing the erratic, chaotic energy radiating from her. The world is not ending, I said, my voice low and steady. It is a tactical escalation, nothing more. Aurora stared at our joined hands. Her tremor slowly subsided. The sudden quiet in the room acted as a shield against the noise of the financial world burning outside her windows. How do we fight a public rumor? She whispered. With documented reality, I said, releasing her hand carefully. I stepped back, giving her space to breathe, preserving her autonomy. He played his hand early. That means he's getting desperate. Let me see the contract he proposed with the private equity firm. Aurora walked to the table, her focus returning. She handed me a thick legal binder. I opened it, flipping to the terms and conditions. I read fast, my eyes scanning the dense legalese. I was looking for the flaw. Arrogant men always left a flaw. My eyes caught on a specific clause on page 42. Here, I tapped the paper. Section 8, Clause B, the termination fee. She leaned in. The clause that says if the board rejects the buyout, the company has to pay a $10 million penalty to the private equity firm? Exactly, I said. It's an extortion clause designed to force the vote. But look at the signatory requirement. It requires the signature of the CEO and the chairman of the board to be legally binding prior to the final shareholder vote. I never signed it, Aurora said, frowning. Elias presented it as a draft. Which means the penalty clause is currently null, I said, closing the binder with a sharp snap. He leaked the rumor to create a panic so you would resign or be ousted tomorrow morning, allowing him to step in as acting CEO and sign the document before the market opens on Monday. So, what do we do? We let him think he's won, I said, my mind calculating the logistics. Tonight, you are going to draft an official termination letter for Elias Vance, citing gross financial misconduct. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., we walk into that boardroom. You do not defend the company's solvency. You present the evidence of his theft, and you fire him. The plan was set. The remaining hours of the night were a blur of printing, collating, and cross-referencing. By midnight, the dossier was complete. It was a lethal, irrefutable weapon made of paper and ink. I sat on the couch, reviewing the final executive summary. Aurora was sitting on the floor nearby, leaning her back against the sofa, reading over her termination speech. The house was completely silent, the storm outside having finally passed. Jackson, she said softly into the quiet. Yes. Why do you do this? She didn't look up from her notes. You could work for any major firm. You could be a partner. Instead, you live out of a suitcase, fighting other people's wars. I looked at her. The ambient light cast soft shadows across her face. Firms have politics. They have compromises. I prefer absolute truth. Numbers don't lie. They don't manipulate. They just are. That sounds lonely, she said. It's efficient. I corrected. She finally turned her head to look at me. Efficiency isn't a substitute for a life. I held her gaze. For a second, the professional wall I maintained so carefully threatened to crack. I wanted to tell her that sitting in this room, watching her fight for her people, felt more like living than anything I had done in a decade. I wanted to reach out and touch her hair. Instead, I closed the dossier. You need sleep. Tomorrow requires precision. I stood up, taking the files to the table. I chose discipline over desire. I chose to keep her safe, even from my own complications. I left a bottle of water on the coffee table near her, then walked to the guest room. I didn't sleep. Sunday morning arrived with clinical clarity. We drove to the corporate headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. The glass and steel tower looked imposing against the blue sky. Aurora wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. The oversized white shirt was gone, replaced by the armor of her position. She looked untouchable. I walked half a step behind her, carrying the black leather briefcase containing the dossier. I wore a charcoal suit, no tie. I was the shadow, the mechanism of her defense. We entered the executive boardroom at exactly 8:58 a.m. The room was already full. 12 board members sat around a massive glass table. The atmosphere was thick with tension, whispers, and the smell of expensive cologne and anxiety. At the far end of the table sat Elias Vance. He looked entirely too relaxed, a smug, paternal smile on his face. Aurora, Elias said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. We were beginning to worry you wouldn't show. Given the press leak last night, the board has convened an emergency session. We need to vote on the private equity acquisition immediately to stabilize the stock. Aurora walked to the head of the table. She did not sit down. She placed her hands flat on the glass, leaning forward slightly. She commanded the room without raising her voice. There will be no vote on the acquisition, Elias, she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had built this empire. A murmur rippled through the board members. Aurora, be reasonable, Elias said, using a patronizing, soothing tone. The company is insolvent. We are bleeding cash. The automation project alone, the automation project was a fiction, she interrupted cleanly. She did not yell. She used facts. It was a mechanism for embezzlement. Elias's smile vanished. Excuse me? That is a severe accusation. You're stressed, Aurora. You're not thinking clearly. I am thinking perfectly clearly, she said. She turned slightly, nodding to me. I stepped forward. I did not introduce myself. I did not ask for permission to speak. I unlatched the briefcase and pulled out 12 thick, bound folders. I walked around the table, placing one directly in front of each board member. I saved Elias for last. I dropped the folder in front of him with a heavy, final thud. My name is Jackson Hart, I said, my voice projecting across the silent room. I am an independent forensic auditor retained by the CEO. Inside those folders, you will find the complete, verified transaction history of Apex Logistics Solutions. The board members opened the files. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of heavy paper. You will note on page 4, I continued, pacing slowly behind the chairs, controlling the room's focus. $3.2 million was authorized for warehouse automation. On page 7, you will see the wire transfer routing numbers. The funds were diverted to a Delaware shell corporation. On page 12, you will find the property tax records and incorporation documents for that shell company. I stopped directly behind Elias Vance's chair. I looked down at him. He was staring at the paper, his face draining of color. The sole beneficial owner of that shell corporation, I stated, the words falling like hammer strikes in the quiet room, is Elias Vance. The boardroom erupted. Voices overlapped in shock and outrage. Elias stood up, his chair scraping violently against the carpet. "This is fabricated," he shouted, pointing a finger at me. "This is a desperate smear campaign by a failing CEO to save her job." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I proved the truth with measurable reality. The documents include certified banking timestamps, IP address logs from your corporate laptop authorizing the transfers, and a sworn affidavit from the Delaware registered agent, I said, my tone ice cold and entirely steady. It is not a smear campaign. It is a felony. The SEC and the FBI have already received digital copies of this dossier. They were transmitted at 8 a.m. this morning. Elias froze. The bluster died in his throat. He looked around the table, but the other board members were already physically leaning away from him, distancing themselves from the blast radius. He was entirely isolated. I stepped back, moving out of the spotlight. I had delivered the weapon. The final blow belonged to her. Aurora stood at the head of the table. She looked at Elias, her expression devoid of pity. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the table. "Elias Vance," she said, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for cause. You are removed from the board of directors. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building. Do not return." She produced the document, the termination notice, and slid it across the glass table. It stopped perfectly in front of him. Elias looked at the paper. He looked at the board. He looked at me, pure hatred in his eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him. The silence returned. The board members stared at Aurora, waiting for her command. "The crisis is over," Aurora said to the room. "The leaked rumor will be countered within the hour by our PR firm, using the audit findings to prove our cash reserves are, in fact, entirely stable. We will recover the stolen funds through legal channels. Now, if there is no further business, this meeting is adjourned." It was a masterclass in leadership. She didn't seek their validation, she simply stated the reality of the New World Order and dismissed them. 10 minutes later, we were standing alone in her private office. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a quiet, profound exhaustion in its wake. Aurora stood by the window looking out over the Los Angeles skyline. I stood by the door, my briefcase in hand. My job was done. The threat was neutralized. The contract was fulfilled. Logic dictated that I leave. I adjusted my grip on the handle of the briefcase. "I'll email the final invoice to your accounting department," I said, keeping my voice level. "I advise a full internal security audit next quarter to ensure Vance didn't leave any secondary back doors." Aurora turned around. She didn't look like a CEO. She looked like the woman who had worn my shirt and drank coffee in the morning sun. "You're leaving," she stated. "My contract is complete. The company is secure." She walked across the room, stopping 2 feet away from me. "And what about you, Jackson? Are you secure? Or are you just going to move to the next disaster, fix the numbers, and disappear again?" "It is what I do," I said. My chest felt hollow. The armor was heavy today. "You didn't just fix the numbers," she said quietly. She took a step closer. The proximity was a disruption to my carefully maintained boundaries. "You made me eat when I was crashing. You held my hand when I was spinning. You didn't just protect my company. You protected me." "It was the logical protocol for asset preservation," I lied, my voice tight. Aurora reached out. She didn't touch my face or my arm. She wrapped her fingers around the handle of the briefcase right next to my hand and gently pushed it downward until the leather touched the floor. She removed the tool of my trade, disarming my excuse to leave. "Stop running," she said. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. She took the final step, closing the distance between us. The scent of vanilla and adrenaline filled my senses. I looked down at her, the restraint I had practiced for 48 hours finally reaching its breaking point. I didn't want to be the shield anymore. I wanted to be the man standing beside her. "Aurora," I warned, my voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I don't know how to stay. I don't have a life outside of the work." "Then we'll build one," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "You don't have to fix me, Jackson. You just have to be here." She made the choice. She claimed the space. I let go of the briefcase entirely. I brought my hands up, framing her face. My thumbs rested against her cheekbones. The physical contact was an absolute transfer of gravity. The wandering stopped. The endless cycle of airports and hotel rooms vanished. This was the destination. I leaned down and kissed her. It was not frantic. It was a seal on a promise. It was the heavy, grounding feeling of a ship finally dropping anchor in a safe harbor. The tension of the past 2 days dissolved into a profound, quiet relief. The kiss was a contract signed without words, a mutual agreement that the isolation was over. When I finally pulled back, I kept my forehead resting against hers. The silence in the room was absolute, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to fill it with data or plans. Love isn't about giving up your power or letting someone else fix all your problems. True partnership is about finding the person who honors your strength but creates a safe space for you to rest your armor. It's about trust over control. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.